Glad to have you back for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. It's time once again for our monthly expert panel as we discuss the latest issues of concern. So joining us today are former Federal Finance and Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver, former Alberta Cabinet Minister and now head of the Canada West Foundation, Gary Marr, and former Ontario Trade Minister Sandra Pupatello. Welcome back, our panel. I'm going to get right into it. Of course, maybe start with Joe Oliver. Joe, obviously, we had in recent days the big session between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden, this virtual, multi-hour virtual summit. And there was a lot of talk about a reset of Canada-U.S. relations. What did you get out of this meeting?
Well, of course, we didn't have the advantage of seeing the body language, the length of the handshake, how warm they were in terms of relating to each other at a more intimate kind of a level, but because it was all remote, obviously, and they had masks on, which kind of hides things. But, I think it went according to what most people thought, but not those who had an exaggerated view that somehow everything was going to change because a lot has changed in the United States. The fundamentals are still the same. I mean, we certainly didn't win on Keystone. That's sort of obvious. And, we didn't win on vaccines because they're going to take care of their own people first. And that's kind of something that people should understand. It's pretty naive to expect the Americans to put anyone other than their own people first. But having said that, the atmospherics were good. I think there's a good interpersonal relationship because they see each other sort of ideologically on the same sort of plane, and issues like climate change and diversity are obviously important to both administrations, and we're going to hear a lot more about that. How it develops into policy and what the implications for Canada are, of course, are critical questions. Obviously, it's going to give an opportunity for this government to do more of some of the things they wanted to do, some of which could be problematic, such as increasing taxes. In terms of climate change and so on, there was some talk about putting excise duties on countries that aren't fulfilling their obligations to reduce greenhouse emissions. How exactly they will do that, whether they in fact would, is hard to know. But there was a lot of talk about that. I mean, I just don't see it happening in respect to the biggest emitters, right, China and India. But, those are some of the things there'll be a lot of talk about as to how much fundamental change in the relationship is going to happen. As I've said before, I'm not expecting anything dramatic. In fact, I'm a little concerned because Democrats tend to be a bit more protectionist overall.
Sure.
I want to take up on something that Joe talked about. I agree with him that the tone that's been set by these two leaders is dramatically different than the tone that was set between the Prime Minister and President Trump, as he then was. So the tone is better. I think that that's a good thing. But the other word that Joe used, and I think it's worth repeating, is that we shouldn't be naive. I mean, we should recall that, the United States and Canada, while they're negotiating the Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, one of the provisions that was set out in that agreement was, not to engage in free trade agreements with non-market economies. And that was really all about China. Who then, signs a phase one trade agreement with China, but the United States? And so we should not be naive to think that, as Joe says, Americans aren't going to put themselves first in the whole issue of dealing with their relationships with other parts of the world, including Canada.
Well, I have to say that one thing I think we can agree is that we won't have the level of surprises that we had under their previous administration, where for our own prime minister or cabinet to need to read about it in the newspaper before they got a phone call. I think those days are over. And the idea that unfortunately in a Zoom world, you don't feel that tight closeness and you can't see the relationship. The media went back and dragged out photos when Biden visited as a VP. And when our prime minister's deputy was speaking, she sort of invoked, the VP Harris's history in
Hold
Montreal.
that thought, Sandra. We're going to take a brief break, but you'll be at the top of the batting order when we come back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. We've got our monthly panel here. Sandra Pupatello, you were talking about Canada-U.S. relations vis-a-vis Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau. Please continue with your thoughts.
Well, just that, Biden had long telegraphed what he was going to do with the pipeline, so it really wasn't a surprise. Historically, though, under Trump, we would sort of read about it in the newspaper that he had a middle of the night idea to start imposing tariffs on various products. So it is a different world. And when you're dealing with a relationship that exists that's warm, at least you won't get those surprises and you can deal with it. I think we need the U.S. We always have. So working that relationship is going to matter when it comes to China, getting our two Michaels free, working on climate change issues. You can't do it without America on side. So that's going to be good for us. So all in all, this is a first. But I think we have to remember we're all in a pandemic. So I don't know what we can expect that is on anybody's agenda except get ourselves out of this pandemic. And to that end, I don't think it's a surprise that the Americans want to inoculate themselves first. Canadians would feel the same way. Let's make sure our Canadians get the vaccine, and then we'd be happy to take care of the world. So, they're not any different from any other country. So to be fair, I think once we can get into, I hope by the summer that we're feeling much more relieved around vaccines, we're going to start turning our attention to international matters and getting our economy back on track.
Gary Marr, maybe I'll start with you. One of the things that was announced, one of the announceables out of this summit was a climate and energy talks structure for North America between Canada and the U.S. and I guess possibly Mexico. What does that mean for Canada's interests, Gary Marr?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think that Mexico is really in a shambolic state as it relates to energy. I'm not sure that Mexico would be included in a North American strategy. It could be a case where it's a bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States that goes forward. I think both countries are probably interested in taking some kind of a bilateral approach as they go to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow in November of this year. And we want to make sure that as Canada, we're not too far ahead of what they do in the United States, or we'll place ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. But the idea of perhaps collaborating on energy and climate together is an idea that makes sense so that we can be two countries that are ready for being competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So the challenge, of course, is that the devil is all in the details. The idea of the structure doesn't concern me. But what comes out of it is something that could be really problematic depending on the details that are struck up.
Joe Oliver, these energy talks, what do you make of that?
Well, I think, at this point, we simply don't know. I mean, the big issue on the energy file, of course, is Line 5. Which is this line which goes between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan under the Straits of Mackinac, and the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, has said that she may revoke the assessment. I don't know that she necessarily has the authority to do that, and Enbridge is challenging her in court. But it raises a very serious, broad issue, which is that we can't count on rationality, on jobs, on economic development, on tax revenue as necessarily being the overwhelming policy drivers to decisions when it confronts the environmental groups and politicians who are beholden to them or agree with them. This is such a critical pipeline for the Americans and for Ontario and Quebec that you would think, to use an old phrase, it's a non-brainer. And nothing is a non-brainer anymore when you're dealing with people who may not have any. we've got to be careful because Canada can be roadkill in this matter, as it was on Keystone. And, I don't know that that's the last we're going to hear of these issues, even if this one is settled the way we want it to. And my guess is, very quietly, you wouldn't have seen that in the public part of the discussion. My guess is that was very much one of the agenda items that our Prime Minister had for the American president to emphasize how important it is for us, but also, of course, for them. And I'm sure the president was not inclined to see that disrupted.
I'm afraid we're going to have to take a break, but we'll get right back to this issue after the break. It is an important one, the Line 5 pipeline. Stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with our expert panel. Sandra Pupatello, Joe Oliver was talking before the break about the Line 5 pipeline. Any thoughts about where we're headed on that one?
Well, I'm hoping we have the time before they get to their, deadline, whether it's legal or not legal, being this May, that maybe we're going to convince them that is a bigger negative impact on Michigan than they might imagine. And I recall the discussions around the steel tariffs, for example, under Trump over there, that it ended up hurting more American companies than it ever hurt Canadian firms. So in time, we have to have an opportunity to educate people to say, look, if you actually do this, here are the people in your own backyard that will suffer because of it. Never mind your Canadian friends, which would be devastating for us. And I think we've got to, plan, if in the eventuality that happens, what are we going to do about it? But I will say that my understanding is at every level of government and on our side of the border, we're reaching out and making sure they know what our position is. We want this thing and we need it. And in the scope of the world and climate change, natural gas, these fossil fuels they're still part of our plan as we go out into, whether it's decades from now that we can eventually get off of fossil fuels. Right now, the world still needs them. So we have to be realistic about what those needs are. And that's a big part of what our needs are in Ontario, never mind the rest of Canada. So I think we have to be practical, we have to be realistic, and we have to have a long-term plan to eventually, obviously, do right by the economy and the climate change. So, in my view, education is the key here. So at least we've got a little bit of time to do that work where Michigan is concerned. But I also hope Joe's right and that we're going to find out that they don't have the authority to do it in any event.
Let me just add
I
one
want to give the
point.
floor to Gary Marr, if we could, because he was a former agent in Alberta and knows a little bit about this issue. So Gary, why don't you take the floor on this too?
A lot of people, when they talk about energy, they talk about transition. And I think even the oil industry in Alberta understands that. And but the transition isn't going to happen over the next 3 months. It's one thing to be like Keystone XL and making a decision about not building a pipeline that would bring you new supply. It's quite another matter to bringing you existing supply that goes to providing the feedstock to the Marathon refinery in Detroit, Michigan. Line 5 is important to the use of in the state of Michigan. That line, after it leaves Michigan, comes back into Sarnia. About half of the crude oil consumed in the province of Ontario comes through Line 5, then connects to Line 9, which goes into Quebec, and about 2/3 of the oil that is consumed in Quebec comes through Line 9, fed by Line 5. And so it is a big issue, and I hope that it wakes up Canadians to understand our dependence upon the oil and gas industry, and that the oil and gas industry is a cleaner production of this type of energy. Of the $1.5 billion that's spent annually on clean technology here in Canada, about 3/4 of it comes from the oil and gas industry. So nobody thinks or gives credit to the oil and gas industry for being a high-tech one, but indeed it really, really is.
Joe,
there's something I'd like to add if I could,
sure.
Tony. These types of decisions can often be really perverse, because if you block Line 5, you can't block the energy from coming in one way or another. And the alternative ways, rail, tanker, maybe truck, are less safe and more emitting of GHG emissions. So in effect, you're going against the alleged purpose of your policy. And the same actually applied to Keystone. Because the U.S. Department of State, which is the one responsible for looking at it, said that emissions would probably increase if you didn't do that because of the alternative ways of bringing oil into the United States. So, sometimes you wonder whether it's just showmanship and symbolism without a real concern for the environment. And that is pretty perverse.
Well, we will obviously be continuing to follow this issue. It's not going to go away, at least before May, is my prediction. So I'm sure it'll be a topic at a future panel. We're going to take one more break and come back to our panel after that break. So please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust at the News Forum. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with our monthly expert panel. This topic and episode seems to be all about Canada-US, and that is, of course, a very important topic. Sandra Pupatello, as a former Ontario Trade Minister, you know about Buy American policies, Democrat administrations, Republican administrations. It appears that Joe Biden is a big supporter of Buy American. I understand that Justin Trudeau was talking at some point about whether there'd be any exemptions for Canadian goods and services. Where do you think that's going from your perspective?
Well, you know what, it just seems agnostic, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they all want to take care of America. And I think in fairness, because many economies around the world have done fairly poorly this year, Canada in this last quarter, I think it's a bit of a surprise when we start seeing our numbers rebounding better than what was expected. But when things are really tense or people are fearful, they do want to sort of hunker down and take care of their own. And their representatives are, in fact, reflecting that. So when we hear Joe Biden say, or, Kamala Harris say, look, we're going to take care of Americans first on the vaccine, for example. And then they're going to talk about what else we're building and what can we build here. And, that sounds a lot like what I used to say when I was the minister for Ontario. We want it here. We want the investments here. And in fairness, we need to broaden our view that international trade is good. And for us to want our companies to trade internationally, we have to be prepared to have the door open to have companies sending their products to us as well. So there's this balance that is uncomfortable at times because we want it all. But realistically, we have to be a trading nation. That's our history. And Canada has to get back to being that and being committed to that. And I think that we are. The idea that we have to get around this pandemic and get our feet back on solid footing as an economy, I think that's going to help. That will help even this Buy America issue.
I want to take up on that point that Sandra just made, that whether it's Republicans or Democrats in control of the White House or the House of Representatives, we've always had to have this delicate balance. And I'll remind viewers that, during the presidential elections, both candidates, Trump and Biden, were talking about some form or another of Buy America. Now, historically, for example, in areas like defense procurement, there's been exemptions that have been given to Canada. I think that it would behoove our federal government and our diplomatic mission in Washington to try and expand those types of exemptions beyond just defense procurement. It's too early to tell what's going to happen, but I would be certainly, impressing that upon Ambassador Hillman, that this would be an important job to try and accomplish.
Joe Oliver. Well, we don't know the details yet. Obviously, Canada keeps trying to get exceptional treatment, and sometimes we're successful, but not always. It's understandable that this administration is going to be a little more focused on Buy American than it was before, even because they don't want to lose support and be subject to criticism by the Republicans for sort of abandoning American blue collar workers, which is of course been was one of the reasons why they lost the previous presidential election and why they lost some ground this time in Congress. So the politics aren't great, particularly when you're talking about policies or infrastructure that's funded by the American government, because then they say, well, look, if we're providing the money, why should we finance it outside unless it's advantageous to us? It all comes down to the need not only not to be naive, but to focus on policies that are going to create growth and wealth, prosperity, competitiveness and productivity in this country, so that we can compete in a pretty tough world where trade is important for everyone. It lifts all boats, but not equally and not all the time. But it's crucial for Canada. Our 76% trading relationship is always going to be overwhelming, but we need to pursue others as well.
Indeed.
And productivity is critical in this context.
I want to thank all of our panelists. It was a great discussion, lots to chew on next time as well. I'm sure we'll have you back very soon. Thank you very much.